He will not force
The title of this lecture is a modification of Beasts and Flowers, the title of Lawrence's 1923 poetry collection. And clearly it substitutes children for flowers, not because we're not... You'd like everyone in the world to be destroyed, said Ursula. I should indeed. And the world empty of people. Yes, truly. You yourself, don't you find it a beautiful, clean thought? A world empty of people? Just uninterrupted grass and a hare sitting up? But, she objected, you'd be dead yourself, so what good would it do you? I would die like a shot, to know that the earth would really be cleaned of all the people. It is the most beautiful and freeing thought. Then there would never be another foul humanity created for a universal defilement. No, said Ursula, there would be nothing. What? Nothing? Just because humanity was wiped out? You flatter yourself. There'd be everything. But how if there were no people? Do you think that creation depends on man? It merely doesn't. There are trees and the grass and birds. I much prefer to think of the lark rising up in the morning upon a humanless world. Man is a mistake. He must go. There is the grass and hares and adders and the unseen hosts, actual angels that go about freely when a dirty humanity doesn't interrupt them. Very nice. If only man was swept off the face of the earth, creation would go on so marvellously with a new start, non-human. Man is one of the mistakes of creation, like the ichthyosauri. But man will never be gone, she said, with insidious, diabolical knowledge of the horrors of persistence. The world will go with him. Oh no, he answered, not so. I believe in the proud angels and the demons that are our forerunners. They will destroy us because we are not proud enough. The ichthyosauri were not proud. They crawled and floundered as we do. And besides, look at the elderflowers and bluebells. They are a sign that pure creation takes place, even the butterfly. But humanity never gets beyond the caterpillar stage. It rots in the chrysalis. It will never have wings. It is anti-creation, like monkeys and baboons. I mentioned in the lecture on religion in week 3 that Lawrence in several respects resembled Lev Tolstoy. The views expressed here by Birkin, and particularly the comment about the ichthyosauri, may have been influenced by him. In the late 1880s, Tolstoy, who was turning 60, suddenly turned against sex altogether. He thought it best if people did not marry, and if they did, to have sexual relations only at distant intervals. These views are voiced by Poznishev, the central character of Kreutzerowa Sonata, the Kreutzer Sonata. Critics of this novella pointed out to him that if Poznishev's recommendations were to be followed, humanity would die out, since deaths would exceed births. Tolstoy responded, "What will die out is man the animal." What a terrible misfortune that would be. Just as the animals of prehistoric times died out, so probably will the human animal. Let it die out. I am no more sorry for this two-legged animal than I am for the ichthyosaurs, etc. What I care about is that true life should not die out, the love of creatures that are able to love. It's remarkable how Lawrentian this passage sounds, and it is in fact far more characteristic of Lawrence than it is of Tolstoy. These two passages that I've just read are proof of humanity's existence only in proportion to its worth. Both men clearly were sharply conscious of Darwin's theories, and rather than conflating them with romantic nationalism and producing such theories as statehood as fascism and Nazism, they retained Darwin's categorization in terms of species. But in Tolstoy's comment there is contradiction. By following Bichet's prescriptions, humanity will die out precisely by virtue of becoming more true in its way of living and loving. Birkin, on the other hand, implies that the survival of the fittest works out not, as Darwin argued, in terms of environmental factors and sexual selection, but in terms of spiritual selection. The spiritually rotten will die out. Lawrence did not live on to the age of nuclear weaponry and did not conceive of a sudden, active suicide of humanity, but a slow, passive one. There is something of the animal rights campaigner in Birkin's picture of the post-human world with a hare sitting up. Not that Lawrence was a campaigner for the rights of animals or any other being, but it was because he had such high standards of humanity that he had such contempt for it during the First World War. On the whole, hares were doing a far better job of being hares than people were of being people, and the more shame them. Because people had failed to be themselves, had been inhuman, they might be superseded by a post-human or non-human world. But this linguistic dichotomy is complicated by the fact that Lawrence did not think that being merely human was sufficient for mankind. To be fully human was also to be open to and to incorporate the non-human. It is not clear to me if he thought that this was true of other species, whether to be a hare, to be fully alive, one must also embrace non-hare reality. But he certainly demanded it of us. The word inhuman in his usage is therefore one of those words which in Lawrence can go either way. Mechanisation is inhuman. Gudrun perceives that the men of Baldover live in a strong, dangerous underworld, mindless, inhuman. They also sound like strange machines, heavy, oiled. When Gerald takes over as the manager of his father's mind, he has a will to, quote, accomplish a purpose irresistibly, inhumanly. It was this inhuman principle in the mechanism he wanted to construct that inspired Gerald with an almost religious exaltation. The world of ice and snow in which he dies is inhuman. Ursula saves herself and Birkin by fleeing from it. But, as I say, inhuman also, it denotes that which humanity must embrace in order to survive and develop. Birkin conceives of the plane on which he wants himself and Ursula to meet. There could be no obligation because there is no standard for action there, because the understanding has been reaped from that plane. It is quite inhuman. So there can be no calling to book in any form whatsoever, because one is outside the pale of all that is accepted and nothing known applies. Correspondingly, when they have their ecstatic experience in the chapter called Excurse, Ursula feels that this was release at last. This was neither love nor passion. It was the daughters of men coming back to the sons of God, the strange, inhuman sons of God who are in the beginning. Humanity, then, is bordered by two kinds of inhumanity, one of which it should shun, the other of which represents its consummation. But just as Birkin and Ursula do not spend all their time in ecstasy, nor should this kind of inhumanity overwhelm an individual's being. 2 weeks ago, I mentioned that Lawrence saw the Teuto-Italian split as one of the fundamental binaries of European history, and the Italians as overwhelmingly human, myriad people, all wrestling their personalities. The Germans, on the other hand, worship faceless trees. The German is a tree soul, and his gods are not human. Neither extreme represents full human potentiality. As I suggested last week, one should combine the Italian and the German, the human and the inhuman. And it follows that contact with animals is good for humans. Tom Brangwyn realises that he must marry Lydia while sitting with the ewes at lambing time. A few years later, he only manages to calm down the 5-year-old Anna, who is screaming for her mother, by taking her to see the cows being given their supper. Mellors and Lady Chatterley first meet at a pheasant coop and have sex after she has handled one of the chicks. But animals are not just soporific or aphrodisiac. They can valuably humble men by asserting themselves against what would nowadays be called speciesism, the human failure to recognise the intrinsic value of other species. We see this in Lawrence's most anthologised poem, The Snake. The first-person speaker finds a poisonous snake drinking from his water trough in Taormina, Sicily. Was it humility to feel so honoured? I felt so honoured. He therefore cannot kill it, even though, quote, the voice of my education said to me, he must be killed. When the snake then goes back in through a crack in the wall whence he came, the speaker finally throws a log at him and immediately regrets it. I despised myself and the voices of my accursed human education, and I thought of the albatross. I had missed my chance with one of the lords of life. There is a less famous but far funnier poem in which the speaker is also humbled by an animal, in this case a bat. He comes into his Florentine room mid-morning and finds a bat flying around it in circles. He opens the window and flicks his white handkerchief about, but it will not leave the room because it is repelled by the sunlight outside. After a long battle, he finally does manage to get the bat to go outside, but that evening he ruminates. I believe he chirps, Pipistrello, seeing me here on this terrace, writing. And then in italics, there he sits, the loud, long one, but I am greater than he. I escaped him. On both occasions, the speaker is learning to respect a natural aristocrat amongst animals. Lawrence's theory of the aristocracy of living things is first suggested in the study of Thomas Hardy of 1914. The title might lead one to expect a study of Thomas Hardy, but on the first page one tumbles headlong into Lawrence's ontology. To wit, the prime function of a living thing is to be itself and to reach into the unknown. Beings may be ranked according to how close they are to the growing tip amongst their kind. Lawrence's human and animal characters are often close to the growing tip, and in this respect they are equals. In 1921, Lawrence published an extraordinary collection of poems called Tortoises. All 6 poems are about tortoises, and the last 2 are about their sex love. The poem Tortoise Shout muses on the sound a male tortoise makes at the point of orgasm, and reflects. Torn, to become whole again, after long seeking for what is lost. The same cry from the tortoise as from Christ, the Osiris cry of abandonment. That which is whole, torn asunder, that which is in part finding its whole again throughout the universe. Christ and Osiris, and of course those two came together in that late story, The Escaped Cock, as we saw in the 3rd week. Christ and Osiris and the tortoise are all alike in being ruptured and seeking wholeness. As we might expect, a novel which has as much contempt for the majority of English humankind as Women in Love, it shows a great interest in animals. They generate 2 chapter titles, Mino and Rabbit, and frequently and suddenly fill the narrative consciousness. Mino is Birkin's cat. Birkin, Ursula and the novel are distracted from their conversation when the Mino goes out into the garden. The young cat trotted lordly down the path, waving his tail. He was an ordinary tabby with white paws, a slender young gentleman. A crouching, fluffy, brownish-grey cat was stealing up the side of the fence. The Mino walked statelily up to her with manly nonchalance. She crouched before him and pressed herself on the ground in humility. He, going statelily on his slim legs, walked after her, then suddenly, for pure excess, gave her a light cuff with his paw on the side of her face. He does this 7 times, and Ursula, who is watching this, objects. Birkin defends him by arguing that the Mino must assert himself as the fate of this fluffy female. The passage uses the language of aristocracy persistently, as though emphasizing that the terms have been wrested away from their usual positions and endowed upon more deserving tomcats. A couple of chapters earlier, we have another example of the male exerting his will over a female to Ursula's disapproval. This male is a Homo sapien, Gerald, and the female is the mare. The sisters are waiting at a level crossing when Gerald trots up and forces his terrified mare to remain by the level crossing whilst a long freight train passes by. He sat glistening and obstinate, forcing the wheeling mare, which spun and swerved like a wind, yet could not get out of the grasp of his will. Both man and horse were sweating with violence. Hermione, on the other hand, reverses these gender roles. When she sees the Mino, quote, she lifted the cat's head with her long, slow, white fingers, not letting him drink, holding him in her power. It was always the same, this joy in power she manifested, particularly power over any male being. She kept her finger on the softly planted paw of the cat, and her voice had the same whimsical, humorous note of bullying. Gerald is also being a bully, although he is successful in dominating the mare, whereas the Mino blinked forbearingly with a male, bored expression, licking his whiskers. What is noteworthy in both cases is that the humans and animals are pitted against each other in the contest of souls, and there is continuity between them. And yet, at times, the novel's narrative questions human understanding of animals. Although the question is raised by and in relation to the characters, since the novel is written by a human, it necessarily reflects on the novel itself. Halfway through the novel, Gudrun and Gerald struggle to control a frenzied and very strong rabbit. After they've put it down in a garden, it flies round and round several times, then suddenly stops and starts nibbling some grass. Gudrun observes her arm is bleeding. It's mad. It's most decidedly mad. Gerald responds, the question is, what is madness? I don't suppose it's rabbit mad. Don't you think it is, she asked. No, that's what it is to be a rabbit. Gerald is sure, yet Bismarck is repeatedly described as ein Wunder, un mystère, and the narrative hesitates to make any judgment as to the sanity or otherwise of this rabbit. Distrust of anthropomorphism is finally made explicit in an incident between the two sisters. One day, as they are walking along a lane, they see a robin singing shrilly and self-importantly. Gudrun grins and comments, isn't he a little Lloyd George of the air? Ursula agrees and, quote, then for days Ursula saw the persistent, obtrusive birds as stout, short politicians lifting up their voices from the platform, little men who must make themselves heard at any cost. But even from this there came the revulsion. Some yellowhammers suddenly shot along the road in front of her, and they looked so uncanny and inhuman, like flaring yellow darts shooting through the air on some weird living errand, that she said to herself, after all, it is impudence to call them little Lloyd Georges. They are really unknown to us. They are unknown forces. It is impudent to look at them as though they were the same as human beings. They are of another world. How stupid anthropomorphism is. Gudrun is really impudent, insolent, making her the measure of everything, making everything come down to human standards. Rupert is quite right. Human beings are boring, painting the universe with their own image. The universe is non-human, thank God. Yet many of the novel's representations of animals, notably the aristocratic Mino, have done precisely this, painted animals with the image of human beings. In this respect, the novel has different modes. I argued in the first week's lecture on consciousness that the novel's characterization has two aspects, a realistic and a non-realistic mode, in the latter of which speech and action partake of the same nature. Ursula's objections to anthropomorphism, like her objections to Birkin's preaching, belong to the realistic aspect of the novel. But within the novel's non-realist mode, it can describe the Mino as a young lord without hypocrisy, because the Mino is not a real cat, but the novel's construction. The term lord is being used as a metaphor, and metaphors are what art asserts the liberty to employ. Nonetheless, the novel points towards real proud tomcats, and purports to describe what such cats are like. Contrast this with the artistry displayed by Loerke in his bronze statue of a horse. The girl sitting on it is naked, squirming, trying to hide her nakedness. Quote, "But there was no hiding. The horse stood stock still, stretched in a kind of start. It was a massive, magnificent stallion, rigid with pent-up power. Its neck was arched and terrible like a sickle. Its flanks were pressed back, rigid with power." Gudrun pays homage to it, but Ursula challenges. "Why did you make the horse so stiff? It is stiff as a block." "Stiff?" he repeated, in arms at once. "Yes, look how stock and stupid and brutal it is. Horses are sensitive, quite delicate and sensitive, really. Wissen Sie," he said, with an insulting patience and condescension in his voice, "that horse is a certain form, part of a whole form. It is part of a work of art, a piece of form. It is not a picture of a friendly horse to which you give a lump of sugar, do you see?" Ursula is angry. "But it is a picture of a horse, nevertheless." "As you like. It is not a picture of a cow, certainly." Here Gudrun broke in, flushed and brilliant, anxious to avoid any more of this, any more of Ursula's foolish persistence in giving herself away. "What do you mean by 'it is a picture of a horse'?" she cried at her sister. "What do you mean by a horse? You mean an idea you have in your head and which you want to see represented. There is another idea altogether, quite another idea. Call it a horse if you like, or say it is not a horse. I've just as much right to say that your horse isn't a horse, that it's the falsity of your own makeup." Ursula wavered, baffled. Then her words came. "But why does he have this idea of horse?" she said. "I know it is his idea. I know it is a picture of himself, really." Loerke snorted with rage. "A picture of myself?" he repeated in derision. "Wissen Sie, gnädige Frau, that is a Kunstwerk, a work of art. It is a work of art. It is a picture of nothing, and absolutely nothing. It has nothing to do with anything but itself. It has no relation with the everyday world. There is no connection between them, absolutely none. And to translate one into the other is worse than foolish. It is a darkening of all counsel, a making of confusion everywhere. Do you see, you must not confuse the relative work of action with the absolute world of art. That you must not do." Gudrun supports this demonic restatement of Oscar Wilde with reference to her own art, tiny sculptures of birds and animals. Ursula was silent after this outburst. She was furious. "It isn't a word of it true, all of this harangue you have made me," she replied flatly. "The horse is a picture of your own stock, stupid brutality, and the girl was a girl you loved and tortured and then ignored." Gudrun is furious that her sister rushes in where angels would fear to tread, but the rhetoric of the scene favours Ursula, who lacks the category of the aesthetic, over the aesthetes themselves. The novel grants most of the animals which it sculpts assertive subjectivity, even whilst describing them in human terms. It is consistent with this attitude that, conversely, animals can be used as symbols for human characteristics. Lawrence's shorter works, in particular, use them in this way. In the lecture on Christianity, I mentioned The Man Who Died. I summarised the plot that Christ comes back to life after his crucifixion, has an affair with the priestess of Isis, and then wanders on in the world. I didn't discuss the source of the story's alternative title, The Escaped Cock. The story opens with a peasant couple who live near Jerusalem. They own a cock which is proud and strong, so much so that they fear it will fly away from them. So they tie it up by the leg by a piece of string. The cock is distraught. He can only have the hens he wants when they choose to walk within his ambit. But one day he breaks the string and escapes. At the very same moment, the man who died wakes up in his tomb, which is nearby. Once he's rolled the stone away and found that particular peasant family, he helps the peasant to catch the cock and is sheltered in their house until he is fully better, has recovered from his wounds, and then he pays to take the cock with him. So they venture into the world together. Soon afterwards, the man who died leaves the cock at an inn where he is staying, where it has rule over a goodly number of hens, and then Jesus goes on to find the equivalent for himself. When Lawrence negotiated this story's publication, the publisher, Charles Lahr, asked for the title to be changed from The Escaped Cock to The Man Who Died. And Lawrence eventually agreed, insisting, though, that the original title should be retained as the subtitle. This projected edition failed to appear, and the next month Lawrence died. The first English edition was published by Secker in 1931 as The Man Who Died, a title that on its own was never approved by Lawrence. What is interesting is that Lawrence insisted that the animal who was Christ's correlate and familiar should carry the title rather than he himself. The title The Man Who Died, the man, not the God, is already iconoclastic in precisely the way that the risen Christ himself is. But The Escaped Cock pushes the point a step further. So far from being God, this man now wants more to resemble a cock. As he leaves the priestess behind, we can almost see him shake his proud coxcomb and hear him crow over his conquest. Animal analogies also play part in some of Lawrence's earlier fictions. The novella The Ladybird was finished in 1921. A young married woman, Daphne, crucially not as part of the couple, visits a Hungarian count who is lying wounded in an army hospital in England. Eventually he awakens her to what this novella calls night living, which is a dark but pure sexuality which contrasts sharply with that which she has with her mild, loving, blonde husband. This Count Dionysus is, like his Greek namesake, repeatedly likened to animals. She finds him so full of life in his own little animal way. The narrator notes that his fine black hair grew uncut over his small animal ears. His family crest bears the ladybird, which is associated with virginity through its connection to Our Lady, but which he also considers to be a descendant of the Egyptian scarab beetle. Once he and Daphne have started an affair, he tells her, you are the night wife of the ladybird. The connection of an animal with an object of Egyptian worship and the Hungarian coat of arms places the story itself in a long tradition of characterizing animals in terms of spiritual principles. This story was published in the same collection as another called The Fox in 1923. In this story, two young women keep a farm together. They get on well with each other, but they find the farming difficult, and their chickens are poached by a fox. I should say the context of this is the First World War, when a lot of young women found themselves without men to live with and set up home together. So this is, for example, two women who set up in a farm. But they're not very good at it, and they find their chickens are being poached by a fox. One day, the woman who's called March, sees the fox face to face. Their eyes meet, quote, and he knew her. She was spellbound. She knew he knew her. Her soul failed her. And then as she goes, she saw his brush held smooth like a feather. She saw his white buttocks twinkle. Given that this is a Lawrence story, we know better than to ignore any reference to twinkling buttocks. It is a sign of good things to come. Sure enough, some days later, a young soldier returning from the First World War turns up at their farmhouse and ends up lodging with the two women. When March first sees him, she freezes. To March, he was the fox. Whether it was the thrusting forward of his head, or the glisten of fine whitish hairs on the ruddy cheekbones, or the bright, keen eyes that can never be said, but the boy was to her the fox, and she could not see him otherwise. Harry proposes to March, and she accepts him, but Bamford, the other woman, is wholly opposed to the match. In one of the least realistic plot twists in the whole of Lawrence's fiction, he kills Bamford whilst cutting down a tree. The tree lands on top of her, which leaves March free to marry her fox, which she does. March's spiritual life, it is implied, is saved by leaving her purely human, purely female household and letting an animal into her. At this stage, I just want to step back a moment to Lawrence's life and see how these attitudes to nature, for want of a better word, were shaped by it. He grew up in a coal mining town just outside Nottingham. It was small enough that the open country was a short walk from any of the houses he lived in, but large enough that Lawrence felt that this countryside was threatened. He is, in fact, one of the most ecologically minded writers of the early 20th century, and it is one source of much current interest in his work. Those who knew him noted his love of nature. At university, botany was the only subject he enjoyed studying. One of the things which the 2008 French Lady Chatelier-Long-Desbois does right is to concentrate its lens on trees, leaves, sunlight and flowers. Jessie Chambers recalls in her memoir that the flowers in their seasons were exciting events. We used to gather armfuls that lay heavy like sheaves of corn. There seemed no flower nor even weed whose names and qualities Lawrence did not know. When he is in his Croydon teaching post, quote, he told me that he was responsible for art and nature study. Occasionally, he asked me to send him specimens for his nature study lessons. Once he asked for twigs of sallow willow and gave me the most precise directions as to where in Warren I was to gather them from. When spring came, he wrote with delight about the glowering almonds and sent me a box of the blossom because we had never seen the miracle of flowering almonds in our countryside. Count Dionysus is offended at the flowers which Daphne brings him in hospital. He likes to see them growing, he does not like to see them cut. He tells her, please do not bring flowers into this grave. Even in gardens I do not like them when they are the upholstery to human life. Use as a symbol, however, does not count as upholstery. Quite reverse, because rather than adorning something, it points to its essence. Daphne herself is repeatedly likened to a hothouse flower. Her hair, her complexion, was so perfectly cared for as to be almost artificial, like a hothouse flower. Whenever you encounter a new Lawrence character, always look out for whether they are likened to flora or fauna. Both can be positive, although hothouse is a warning sign of someone in an artificial climate in need of rescue. In the lecture on humour, we saw that the scene from the 1969 Women in Love film, in which Birkin expands the meaning of figs in a script which quotes directly from Lawrence's poem Figs. Crucially, not only are figs explained in terms of female genitals, but women are described in terms of figs. In Bavarian Junctions, blue flowers are described in terms of the Persephone myth, which itself explains plants in terms of people. Reach me a gentian, give me a torch. Let me guide myself with the blue forked torch of this flower down the darker and darker stairs, where blue is darkened on blueness. Even where Persephone goes just now, from the frosted September to the sightless realm where darkness is awake upon the Sark, and Persephone herself is but a voice. But since flowers, like animals, can assert their own integrity of being, they can also, like the snake at Lawrence's water trough, put humans to shame. Lawrence explicitly pins this shame on socialists in the poem Hibiscus and Salvia Flowers. Lawrence objects less to what the socialists are in themselves, which he calls ists, than to the fact that they wear salvia and hibiscus flowers. Who on their breasts put salvia and hibiscus? Rosy, scarlet and flame rage, golden-throated. Who said they might assume these blossoms? What god did they consult? Come now, speaking of rights, what right had you to this flower, the exquisite and ageless aristocracy? What rot to see the cabbage and hibiscus tree as equals? What rot to say the louts along the Corso in yellow suits and in Sunday suits and yellow shoes are my equals? I am their superior, saluting the hibiscus flower, and not them. And still I cannot bear it that they take the hibiscus and the salvia flower. The communists then ought more to resemble the flowers which they bear. Yet in a certain respect we all resemble flowers and would do better to acknowledge this. Lawrence makes this explicit in the introduction to the collection in which it appears, Pansies. The fairest thing in nature, a flower, still has its roots in earth and manure, and in the perfume there holds still the faint, strange scent of earth, the under-earth in all its humidity and darkness. So it is. We all have our roots in the earth. And it is our roots that now need a little attention, need the hard soil eased away from them and softened so that a little fresh air can come to them and they can breathe. For by pretending to have no roots, we have trodden the earth so hard over them that they are starving and stifling below the soil. We have roots. And our roots are in the sensual, instinctive and intuitive body, and it is here that we need the fresh air of open consciousness. The pansies are not just themselves then, but they are thoughts about man. The comment on the pun of the title makes this clear. This little bunch of fragments is offered as a bunch of pensées, and lycée pansies, a handful of thoughts. Or, if you will have the other derivation of pansy, from penser, to dress or soothe a wound, that's P-A-N-S-E-R, they are my tender administrations to the mental and emotional wounds we suffer from. In the last part of this lecture, I want to come on, as promised, to children. Like most coal miners' children, he had several siblings. He was born the fourth out of 5. Since he was almost the youngest, he was not obliged to look after younger ones, but he was intuitively good with children and they liked him. He was a highly gifted teacher, as the school inspectors who observed his teaching recognized. In his fiction, he pays careful attention to children at a younger age than can be found in most other fiction. He does this particularly in his early major works, Sons and Lovers, and The Rainbow, and Women in Love. Interestingly, his children are usually girls. There are several families made entirely of daughters. It is Ursula that we follow at the end of The Rainbow. She has 6 sisters and 1 brother. The only major boy-child character is Paul Morrell. But after Women in Love, in this as in other respects, there comes a change. Child characters not only fade into the background, but the subject of children is specifically resisted. Lily tells Aaron in Aaron's Rod, I'll be hanged if I can see anything high and holy about children. Aaron's daughters, Millicent and Marjorie, are neither striking nor appealing. We remember them principally for squabbling over a Christmas tree bauble. This can be correlated with Lawrence's new conception of masculinity hostility in the 20s novels which separates itself from children. Lawrence was also reacting still against Frida's pain at being separated from her own children. In the final novels, the child reappears, but only as a symbol of rebirth. Both Lady Chapley's lover and the escaped cock end with pregnancy just before Lawrence died. His attitude towards children contrasts with most of the prevailing views of his own and the preceding century. For a start, he was not with the Romantics, or Wordsworth, or Dickens, in part, who conceived of children as possessing original innocence and being gradually corrupted by and by becoming adults. Williams, the chief disruptor of Ursula's class during her first teaching job, contradicts such a view. When Ursula has finally beaten this child into submission, she saw his face beneath her white, with eyes like the eyes of a fish, stony, yet full of hate and horrible fear. He was a beast thing. Nor did he have a Catholic or Calvinist sense of the original sin of children, which may be alleviated by strict discipline and piety. In Sons and Lovers, he has a partly Freudian understanding of the child's psyche, but even there he is feeling his way towards something new. The key text is Fantasia of the Unconscious and his essay on child consciousness, and this is appropriate because in it is the touchstone of all his thought about the human psyche he locates in the child. The child's unconscious is blank but not innocent. A child not only must but should develop. Quote, childhood is a chrysalis from which each must extricate himself, and the struggling youth or maid cannot emerge unless by the energy of all its powers. Health, to Lawrence, entails balanced development in the four primary areas. So we're back again with this spiritological physiology. The solar plexus, the lumbar ganglion, the cardiac plexus, and the thoracic ganglion. As far as physical education is concerned, he considers exercise without the element of a game to be mechanical and as bad as masturbation. One of the few comments that Lawrence made on the subject of masturbation, positive or negative, but they are always negative. Crucially, he believes that a certain roughness with children is necessary to make them independent and proud. From bitter experience, he argues that mothers can spoil their children by cleaving to them, and children who cleave to their mothers should be smacked. Tom and Lydia Brangwyn in The Rainbow implicitly follow most of these precepts. They do not over-educate Anna, they do not cling to her or allow her to cling to them. She is the beneficiary of their successful marriage. She also has an independent existence to which the narrative pays careful and close attention. After the birth of her stepbrother Tom, Anna, quote, became more childish, not so abnormal, and charged with cares she could not understand. The charge of the mother, the satisfying of the mother, had devolved elsewhere than on her. She became an independent, forgetful soul, loving from her own centre. Brangwyn, her stepfather, teaches her silly fairy tales, which are comic relief, quote, after the poignant folk tales she had had from her mother, which always troubled and mystified her soul. She is queenly. I'm dwelling on her because I think she is one of the best representations of children in Lawrence's fiction. She likes the neighbours to acknowledge her and, quote, had a touch-me-not way of blighting the inane inquiries of grown-up people. We see this extraordinarily realistic 5-year-old growing into adulthood, and we see the child, the mother to the woman. But our access to her soul is limited. She tends to be described from the outside in terms of her behaviour and signalled by the woolly blonde hair and dark eyes which are mentioned almost every time that she is. There is a difference in the representation of her daughter, Ursula. Her soul is more transparent. Its dates are described directly, and these descriptions correlate with the greater extent to which this soul is troubled and will go through far greater pain before it can reach satisfaction in delicate balance with Birkin's. Women in Love's Winifred, who is 13 or 14, is a more troubling child. Certainly, she is a growing tip. That's why the novel pays her attention. This novel, more than any other, pays no attention to those who are not growing tips. Birkin tells her brother Gerald that Winifred has got a special nature, and if you can put her into the means of being self-sufficient, that is the best thing possible. She'll never get on with the ordinary life. You find it difficult enough yourself, and she is several skins thinner than you are. But in the novel, she is associated with Gudrun, not Ursula, and this does not bode well. She is not just modern, in the sense in which the Brangwyn sisters are, and their 19th century parents are not. She is, if anything, postmodern, perpetually unstable, detached, and ironic. The narrator tells us she was an odd, sensitive, inflammable child, having her father's quiet bearing, but being quite detached, momentaneous. She was like a changeling indeed, as if her feelings did not matter to her, really. She was full of the warmest, most delightful affection for a few things, for her animals in particular. But if she heard that her beloved kitten Leo had been run over by the motor car, she put her head on one side and replied, with a faint contraction-like resentment on her face, "Has he?" Then she took no more notice. She loved people who would make life a game for her. Winifred did not notice human beings unless they were like herself, playful and slightly mocking. She would accept nothing but the world of amusement, and the serious people of her life were the animals she had for pets. On these she lavished, almost ironically, her affection and her companionship. When she responds to Gudrun's suggestion that they paint the aforementioned rabbit, Bismarck, she says, "Oh yes, I want most awfully to do Bismarck. He looks so splendid this morning, so fierce. He is almost as big as a lion." And the child chuckled sardonically at her own hyperbole. What is most disturbing about this representation is that she resembles, in fact, not so much Gudrun as Loerke. Loerke, in his turn, is described as an odd creature like a child, and like a troll, quick, detached. To Gudrun, he is a mud child. As Glenicke points out in her illuminating study of children in Lawrence, he is the end point of Lawrence's exploration of the modern spirit of childhood and its perversion. Even animals can be corrupted within modernity. The only drawing which we witness Winifred produce is of her pet Pekingese, Lulu. When she shows it to Gudrun, it turns out to be a grotesque little diagram of a grotesque little animal, so wicked and so comical, a slow smile came over Gudrun's face unconsciously. And at her side, Winifred chuckled with glee and said, "It isn't like him, is it? He's much lovelier than that. He's so beautiful. Lulu, my sweet darling." And she flew off to embrace the chagrined little dog. He looked up at her with reproachful, saturnine eyes, vanquished in his extreme agedness of being. Then she flew back to her drawing and chuckled with satisfaction. He is extremely aged because he is of a Chinese breed and therefore of an ancient race. And within modernity, he is flattened into caricature. He is a lapdog, bred into human ways, hardly real at all, the equivalent amongst beasts of a hothouse flower, and he therefore has no remedy against his caricature. Most animals and plants, however, are not like this, even in an age in which childhood is represented by Winifred. Most flora and fauna retains its inhuman integrity, its capacity to dilute humanity by its essence, to enrich writers' spiritual vocabulary by its symbols, and to renew civilization by its example. Lawrence's criticisms of humanity and his interest in non-human life are connected, but are not locked in mutual support. Humans at their best are far better than mares or hares or